Hello, and welcome to another rim-rocking episode of Zilog and Moto. I'm your host Dave, and this is your mostly weekly look into the English language libraries of the Sega Master System, Genesis/Mega Drive, Sega CD, and 32X. Rim-rocking? Yeah, I don't know, it just doesn't feel right when I say it. Perhaps I should leave it to professionals like Tim Kitzrow or Dick Vitale. Probably for the best. Anyway, if you're not familiar with the channel, every week or so I pick one of the almost 1,300 games from the previously mentioned libraries and do a deep dive into the game, going over things like where it was released, differences in cover art or versions, the manual, and maybe other bits that might have originally come with the game, its cultural significance, especially if there was an arcade presence involved, and of course actually playing and reviewing the game to see if it's something that we should still be talking about in 2023, or if it's okay for it to fade into obscurity, like a 70s Hollywood feature that had a big-name star, but that now is available completely free on YouTube because the right holders know they can't make any money on licensing it to streaming services anyway. Way back in Season 1, Episode 37 to be specific, I reviewed Sega's first shot at a basketball game for the Genesis, Pat Riley Basketball, aka Super Basketball, aka Pat Riley's Slammin' and Jammin' Basketball, aka its Mega Drive name, Super Real Basketball. I guess Sega thought that not enough people would know who Pat Riley was outside the United States, but come on, Super Real? Really? That was the best you could come up with? Anyway, if you aren't familiar with Pat Riley, he was the coach of the Showtime-era Lakers, winning 5 NBA titles in the 80s as an assistant and head coach. But by 1992, Riley had moved on from the Lakers to coach the Knicks, and while he was still a great coach, he was now 4 years away from his last NBA championship, so Sega decided it was time to move on, this time selecting a player to be their face of the basketball franchise instead, hoping to replicate the success that they'd had in the Joe Montana football series. What came next, I think, was a bit of a surprise if you were following the NBA for the 1991 to 1992 season. The NBA had plenty of established stars, but certain marquee players already had their likenesses attached to specific games, like Michael Jordan and Larry Bird in Jordan vs. Bird 1-on-1, or Magic Johnson in Magic Johnson's Fast Break. However, that left plenty of big names, players such as Charles Barkley or Karl Malone, two of the greatest power forwards ever to play the game. Or Patrick Ewing and Hakeem Olajuwon, towering centers for the Knicks and Rockets respectively, that owned the paint on both offense and defense. And not to mention guys like Clyde the Glide Drexler, or the only guy to beat Michael Jordan in the dunk contest, the human highlight film Dominique Wilkins, all players who were in the prime of their career. Instead, Sega decided to go with an up-and-coming talent, fresh off of only his third All-Star appearance, and as a result, we got David Robinson's Supreme Court for the Genesis in June of 1992. David Robinson's Supreme Court is not merely Pat Riley Basketball 2 and is very much a departure from the previous game. But just because it's different from Pat Riley Basketball, does that mean it's the better game? And does David Robinson's Supreme Court benefit from the inclusion of the man himself? Or does it really not matter? Well, we'll take a look at all of that and more, but first, a look at the package.
And this is my copy of David Robinson's Supreme Court. Funny story, this is actually my second copy of the game. You see, this is my original copy, that I'll be selling or otherwise getting rid of at some point, and you can probably just tell from the outside why I'm getting rid of it, as this original copy has all sorts of issues. The hang tab was removed from the top, the case doesn't like to stay closed, and if you look at the inner label, it's slightly sun-bleached, water-damaged, with a stain on the lower left-hand corner, and not only is the inner cover torn on the back, this is one of those where they cut out the barcode on the back for some sort of mail-away order. But as bad as all that is, the reason why I bought a better copy is something even more bizarre that I'll get to in a minute. Thankfully, this replacement copy that I picked up in Atlanta last year is in great shape with none of those issues, and will be in my collection for years to come. As far as the front cover goes, Sega elected to not go with a photo for the artwork and instead went with a drawing of Robinson dunking at home. The art was probably based on a real picture, I'm not sure, but it looks great, and someone that's nearsighted, like me, might not even notice it's not a photo until they get up close to it. I especially like the little touches, like the lines used around the hands and the ball to make the art seem like it's an in-motion shot. I've got to be honest though, I don't love the logo, and having David vertically at the beginning while the rest of it is set off to the right horizontally just looks weird. And then having the Sega seal centered below it seems incredibly odd as well. I don't know that I've seen another cover that just has the seal like that. For the European version, they basically used the same picture and logo, just composited it differently. But the Japanese version, oh boy, I unironically love this cover. Same art, but rather than the black standard cross-hatching, we've got the American flag as the background, and then the name shortened to just David Robinson Basketball. This is one where I would love to have the Japanese version just to have it, and it looks like it's all in English anyway based on the screenshots in the back. Flipping over to the back of the US version, it's got that awkward logo again at the top, followed by what appears to be minimal flavor text and 5 screenshots. Which seems great in theory, but once you look closer at the screenshots, what you're really getting is one normal size screenshot and then 4 close-ups of the various dunks that you can do in the game. Which is okay, I guess, and I see where they were going by trying to attract kids with the dunks. Electronic Arts tend to do similar things in their basketball games, but it definitely feels a bit limited in what they were trying to show off here. They're good quality at least. As far as the flavor text goes, it does describe what you do in the game, but some of this stuff sounds like it was written by someone who's never watched basketball. Foot slashing run? Robinson proves his case? Who talks like that? Opening up the case, and this copy has a manual and cartridge that are in good shape, just like the case. The manual is actually why I had to buy this second copy, and why I didn't review the game sooner. You see, this is the manual I originally had, and it appears that maybe previously had been a rental copy and they laminated every page and then stapled it back together. No idea how I didn't catch that when I originally purchased it. As far as the non-laminated version goes, it's fine and about what you would expect from a first-party Sega manual at the time, with a good mix of screenshots and fully explaining the game. I did like how they gave a suggestion on what lineups to use for which teams. It wasn't necessary, and the players can pretty much figure out which players they like easy enough, but I thought it was a nice touch on Sega's part. Okay, that's the package. Let's hoop it up and see how life is in Mr. Robinson's neighborhood. I mentioned earlier that while this is Sega's follow-up to Pat Riley Basketball, it should in no way be considered a sequel to that game. It's simply just Sega's next basketball game for the Genesis. Although, in an odd coincidence, both games had their 8-bit versions canceled at the last minute, with the Master System version of Pat Riley Basketball being shelved, and then the same with the Game Gear version of David Robinson's Supreme Court. But both prototype dumps for both of those games are available on the internet if you're curious. However, the premature demise of the 8-bit versions are really about the only thing that can be seen as similar between Pat Riley Basketball and David Robinson's Supreme Court. So then, with Supreme Court, as I'm going to refer to it for the rest of the review because David Robinson's Supreme Court is a mouthful, being its own basketball title, you might be wondering what Sega did to make it stand out amongst other basketball games of the era. And the answer is a few things, but before I get into all that, I should probably talk about the one thing that Supreme Court doesn't have that unfortunately was actually somewhat common at the time, and that's NBA licensing. You might have noticed on the cover of the game, on the game's title screen, that while David Robinson is depicted wearing a uniform that looks somewhat similar to his standard number 50 jersey with the San Antonio Spurs, nowhere is the Spurs name, or anything to do with the NBA at all, for that matter, mentioned in the game. And that's because Supreme Court is like many other sports games at the time, bereft of any kind of professional sports licensing, whether that be from the NBA itself or from the NBA Players Association. The only licensed thing in the game is David Robinson himself, and even he doesn't appear as much as you might think for a game that bears his name, but more on that in a minute. With no licensed teams or players, sometimes sports games in that era would still attempt to emulate a professional sports league by having teams that perhaps have the same cities as the professional teams, with their same uniform colors, and then having a roster with players that, while they don't have the names of the actual players, they might at least share numbers or stats with real people, to make it clear who they're supposed to be. in an attempt to emulate real life while getting around paying for it. Supreme Court does not do that. In fact, Supreme Court features one of the most odd in-game leagues that I've ever seen. To start out with, how many teams do you think are in Supreme Court? Well, during the 1991-1992 NBA season, there were 27 teams. So maybe 27? No, not quite. Well, okay, I know I already said that Supreme Court isn't related to Pat Riley basketball, but it at least should have more than the 8 teams that were in that game, right? Wrong again. No, Supreme Court features an amazing, colossal 4 teams. That's right, 4. Okay, technically there's an all-star team that features the only time that you will see the game's namesake other than some throwaway halftime show segments, but that team acts as the final boss of the game, so to speak, and they aren't selectable. So, with only 4 teams, you'd think they'd at least have creative names like in Pat Riley basketball, right? Unfortunately, no, they're just named for the cities, Los Angeles, Chicago, New York, and Detroit. But their logos look nice, I guess. While I think having only 4 selectable teams in a game is a bit of a disappointment, there is a reason for it, believe it or not. In Supreme Court, each of the teams only have a partially static lineup. Now, stay with me here because this might sound a little confusing. Each team has 10 roster spots, 4 forwards, 4 guards, and 2 centers. And the team's bench is set, with each team having bench players that all have similar strengths and weaknesses. For instance, Chicago's bench shoots well, but isn't good at defense, and New York's bench is good at rebounding but slow. It's important to know this because all of the team's starters are drafted from a pool of 20 players when you start a game, meaning that chances are every time you start up Supreme Court fresh, you'll probably have a different experience. It's an original setup for a sports title to be sure, and I like how it kind of has a pickup game feel to it where players are picked for the teams before the game starts. And with this drafting setup, I kind of understand why the game only has 4 teams. But if I'm going to be honest, I still think it's a self-limiting thing, and there had to be a better way to do this. Perhaps have a standard game mode and a custom game mode, something like that. Despite the fact that the game only has 4 playable teams, it has a few more game modes than you might expect. There's the standard exhibition mode and tournament mode that most games are going to have, with the exhibition mode allowing for playing against the computer or a second player. Also, exhibition mode can be played in both 3-on-3 or 5-on-5 versions, but the 3-on-3 version isn't a 3-on-3 half-court mode, as has been popularized in the recent decade or so. It's a full-court game, which I guess is for people that think it's too hard to move the players around on the court normally. I mean, I'm not going to complain about having more options, I'm just not sure who this is for. Finally, Exhibition Mode also has a role-playing variation, where you pick one specific player to play as, rather than switching between players as you normally would. Well, that's how it's supposed to work anyway, but in reality you're picking a player and a position, so that if you sub your player out to get a rest, the computer doesn't just take over until you sub back in, which probably would have made more sense. Instead, you then take over the player that's playing at that position on the court. It kind of breaks some of the immersiveness of a true role-playing mode, but at least they tried, I suppose. But there's a bonus to role-playing mode, and if your player is determined to be the game's MVP based on their performance, you'll then get challenged by David Robinson's All-Star team, just like if you'd won tournament mode. And I like that, as exhibition mode in sports games is usually just a throwaway practice affair. As far as the main tournament mode goes, there's not much to say. You'll draft your team while the computer picks for the other 3, with the order being determined by random, and then you'll play a game against each team to determine the seeding, before finally a semifinal and a final game. Assuming you win the tournament championship, there's that pesky David Robinson's All-Star team there again to challenge you to a final game. The game doesn't feature battery backup and instead relies on a relatively simple password system to save your progress after each game, except for that championship game. Yeah, for some strange reason, the game doesn't give you a password before the final matchup with the All-Stars, so if you get to that point, you have to win 2 games in a row, so make sure you've got time for 2 games. As far as the gameplay goes, it's not bad, and it certainly plays much better than Pat Riley basketball did. Gone are all the cinema breaks in the action, and instead everything stays firmly on the court. Also, in something that I think was pretty original at the time, the game action is displayed in an isometric style to try to give the game more of a 3D feel, which, while it has some weirdness, I think is a great idea, and apparently Electronic Arts thought so as well, because when they reinvented their basketball series with NBA Live 95, they also went with an angled presentation. It does take some getting used to, however, as the screen flips orientation when you pass the half-court line, rather than just scrolling back and forth. After a game or two, you'll get used to it, but don't be surprised if there's more than a few accidental backcourt violations due to the court changing direction. Pro tip: leave the game's default setting of fade intact for this, as it gives you a split second to reorient yourself and avoid that sort of thing. To go along with how the game is structured, the actual controls are nice and simple as well, with you having one button to pass or strip the ball, one button to shoot or jump for a block, and then one button to switch players or call for the ball in role-playing mode. This was one of those things that I liked the most about the game, in that after you played a game or two, the controls just feel natural, and you aren't having to do too much to control the on-screen action. There was one choice though that might be frustrating to players unless they'd read the manual, and that's how free throw shooting works. In free throw mode, a floating basket moves back and forth across the real basket, and lights up when they're aligned. Stupid me thought, oh, okay, I'll hit the button now. And of course I missed every time, even with players that were great shooters. I had to go back and figure out that you have to hold the shot button down, and then release when it's lined up, to actually make the shot. So that probably could have been a bit more intuitive, but once you learn how to do it, you can hit them almost every time, no matter who is shooting the ball. One other place that I have to mention that could have been designed better is the substitution screen. Once you figure it out, it's fine, and I like that the players have a graphical representation of how tired they are, but the problem comes with having the same menu be used not just to swap players, but to also set man-on-man matchups for players on the other team, and choose what level of defense the players are playing at. Again, once you figure it out, it's okay, but even then, it's a bit clunky, and there just had to be a better way to do this. As far as the graphics go, they're fine. There's nothing here that's going to blow you away, but the game doesn't look bad either, and I enjoyed the fact that they programmed in a variety of different dunk animations. I think my main complaint is that all of the players look pretty similar. Sure, if a player is bald or is wearing a headband, they'll stand out. But what if you have two players that have the same skin color and hair? How do you know that you've got a player selected that's great at hitting threes versus a player that should be playing down low in the lane? Well, you don't. At least not really. The more you play, the more you can kind of guess which player you have selected by where all the other players are set up on the court when you get into your offense. But even then, it's not an exact science, and trust me, you do not want to be taking three-point attempts with players that aren't good at it. The fact that there's no indicator of which player seems silly, they should have at least included an option to turn it on or off. The music and sound isn't nearly as good as the graphics. There's options for turning off one or both, and you're not going to miss much either way. I'm pretty sure there's only one music track that plays the entire time during games, with a few other tracks mixed in for things like the studio segments, but regardless, any of it is mediocre at best, with the intro track sounding bizarrely like it's missing notes. Not sure what happened there. Part of the music is credited to Mark Miller, who actually has a decent resume of games, including work on Toe Jam and Earl. So I'm just going to assume the in-game sound was considered an afterthought, and they weren't given much time or resources to work with. David Robinson's Supreme Court is a game that I enjoyed playing this past week, and it was amusing to be reminded of how it was when I originally played it 30 years ago. It's certainly a step up from Pat Riley basketball, which is a good thing, but if I'm being honest, it's not saying much at all, and just because I enjoyed playing it for a few matchups does not mean I think it's a good game. In fact, it's kinda crappy, and I'd use another word for it here, but I just had someone comment that they appreciated that I kept these reviews clean, so I suppose I'll keep that going for now. This game is the definition of a rental game, one that you could easily beat over a few days and then take it back to Blockbuster to move on to the next thing. Bulls vs. Lakers in the NBA playoffs came out literally the same month as this game, and while I think David Robinson's Supreme Court might play a little bit better, nothing else it does compares. As a result, I'm giving David Robinson's Supreme Court 2 stars. Hopefully Sega will have had things figured out by the time I get to NBA Action 94, but as it stands, it's clear that baseball and football were more in their wheelhouse at the time.
And that was David Robinson's Supreme Court for the Genesis. I really enjoyed getting reacquainted with this game this week, and I always thought David Robinson the person was one of the cooler and somewhat underrated stars of the league at the time, but playing this game now as an adult makes me realize just how much wrong there is with it, and how many things that Sega could have done a lot better, as opposed to what we actually got. And it's kind of sad, as there is potential for a good game here, but it's just not realized at all, as it's held back by, at best, confusing design choices. This is one that I don't need to ever play again after this review. Next time on Zilog and Moto, I don't know, it was supposed to be Mortal Kombat for the Master System, but I kind of forgot that I didn't own a copy of it yet. It's on order, and it's supposedly on its way across the pond, along with a modded Master System 2 and copies of Alien Storm and Putt and Putter, but who knows when any of that will actually get here, and it's kind of hard to review a game that you don't actually have. So instead, I'll be picking something else from the Master System library. I know which one it's going to be. Hide your cats, everyone! Well, that's it for Zilog and Moto episode 190. If you liked what you saw here and want to see more, please think about liking and subscribing if you are so inclined, as it'll help more people see these videos. But most importantly, whatever you like to play, have fun, and be excellent to each other. Later!